If you drive down Interstate 55 in Illinois, the landscape is mostly flat cornfields and billboards. But just across the river from St. Louis, something massive breaks the horizon. It rises 10 stories into the air, covering 14 acres at its base. That is a footprint larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This isn't a hill, it is Monk's Mound, a colossal earthen pyramid built by human hands, and it is the heart of America's first metropolis. 900 years ago, this wasn't a quiet field. It was the center of a civilization that dominated the Midwest. At its peak, around 1100 AD, the city of Cahokia had a population that rivaled London. It was a bustling urban center of astronomers, engineers, high priests, and warriors. But for centuries, the history books got it wrong. We were taught that pre-Columbian North America was a vast wilderness inhabited only by small nomadic tribes. We were told there were no cities here. That was a lie. Beneath the soil of the American Midwest lies the evidence of a sophisticated empire, a society that engineered massive public works, played complex political games, and performed rituals of life and death that would shock you today. They rose with explosive speed, reshaped the continent, and then they vanished. Who were the people that built this city of the sun? How did they sustain tens of thousands of people without the wheel, without steel, and without beasts of burden? And what terrifying event caused them to abandon it all? Welcome to Cahokia, the lost empire of America. And before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where you are joining us from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to read through the comments and see how far these stories travel across the world. So let me know below. And now, let's return to the year 1050. You can stand out there on a bright Illinois afternoon with the sky stretched wide and the wind moving through the corn like water, and it feels ordinary. That's the trick of this place. Modern America is really good at turning ancient landscapes into background noise. You've got the interstate humming nearby, you've got St. Louis just over the river, you've got planes crossing the sky, and if you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd assume you're standing in some nice park that happens to have a big hill. People bring kids, they take photos, they walk the steps, they look out from the top, and then they drive home and grab dinner. But if you slow down, if you really let your eyes follow the lines, what you're seeing isn't a hill at all. It's a decision. It's a city's ambition turned into earth and geometry. Monk's Mound is not subtle. It's broad-shouldered. It sits there like it owns the horizon, and in a way it does, because for centuries it has been the stubborn fact that refuses to fit the old story. And that old story is the one a lot of Americans absorbed without even realizing it, that before Europeans, most of North America was basically empty, or at least empty in the sense that mattered to the people writing the textbooks. No big construction, no large cities, no complex political centers. The mounds complicate that, and for a long time people didn't like complicated. So they explained the mounds away, or they ignored them, or they destroyed them, and then acted surprised that there wasn't much left to study. If you're from the Midwest, you've probably heard some version of this. Farmers used to plow into these strange rises, or bulldozers flattened old Indian mounds for roads and neighborhoods, and nobody thought twice. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, St. Louis itself had mounds, big ones, right there in what became downtown. They got leveled, not by an army, by development, by progress, by the everyday machinery of a growing American city that never imagined those earthworks were part of an urban past that could stand next to any other. And I want to sit with that for a second, because it tells you something about how history gets lost in plain sight. Most people imagine a lost city as something swallowed by jungle, vines, ruins, dramatic archaeologists hacking their way through green walls. Cahokia isn't that kind of lost. Cahokia was buried under assumptions. It was paved over by a story people were comfortable with. And the reason we start with the cornfields, with the highway, with the modern skyline in the distance, is because it's the perfect visual metaphor without being a metaphor at all. America built right on top of America. Now, picture this same spot around the year 1100. You're not hearing traffic. You're hearing voices, dogs, children, the thud of footfalls on packed earth, smoke drifting up from cooking fires. And then, this is the part that's hard for our brains because we're used to thinking in snapshots, you're seeing movement in every direction. People carrying bundles, people walking in groups, people coming in from outlying areas to the center. This is not a lonely ceremonial site visited once a year. This is daily life in a place that has a downtown, a place with a central precinct, a massive plaza, a skyline made out of temple platforms and neighborhoods spreading outward. It's a city in the simplest sense, a lot of people living close together, organized around shared infrastructure and shared power. And if that sentence feels strange, a city in the Midwest in the 11th century, good. That little moment of discomfort is exactly where the story begins to wake up. Because the minute you accept that this was a city, you have to ask city questions. Who's in charge? Who does the labor? Who decides what gets built and where? How do you feed everyone? How do you keep order? How do you bring strangers together and convince them they belong to the same thing? Monk's Mound is the loudest piece of evidence, but it's not the only one. The entire landscape around it was engineered: mounds, plazas, causeways, wooden structures that marked the sky. And here's what I love about starting from the present and walking backward. You realize how much was deliberate. The mound is not randomly placed. The plaza is not random. The alignments aren't random. This is planning on a scale that requires leadership, and it requires buy-in, and it requires something like a shared worldview. People don't move millions of cubic feet of earth just because they're bored. They do it because the work means something, politically, spiritually, socially. And for the people living there, it must have felt like living inside a story that was bigger than any one person. You're a farmer, you're a craftsperson, you're a kid learning which paths to take and which parts of the precinct feel too important to wander into. You're watching elites climb up toward the temples. You're hearing drums on certain days. You're seeing processions. You're hearing the announcements before a feast. You don't need to understand the whole system to feel it. You can feel power in the way space is arranged. You can feel it when you stand at the edge of the plaza and look up. Now, take a step back again, still in the present, and notice something else. The site is called Cahokia, but that name doesn't come from the people who built it. It comes from a later indigenous group the French encountered in the region. That's a little detail that matters because it's a reminder we're dealing with a world that didn't leave us its own written label. We're reconstructing from earth and bone and charcoal and pottery, from patterns in soil, from the way posts were set, from the way streets and buildings repeat. It's detective work, but it's also humility. We can say a lot, and we can say it with confidence, but we also have to leave room for the fact that the people of this city had names for themselves, names for their leaders, names for their gods, names for the seasons, and most of those names are not recoverable. So when I say Cahokia, I'm using the modern label as a convenience, like a pin on a map, not as the city's true identity. The identity is in the built world, and the built world is telling you right away that this wasn't some fringe outpost. This was a magnet, a place that pulled people in. One of the reasons archaeologists talk about Cahokia the way they do is that it seems to have grown incredibly fast around the mid-11th century, almost like someone flipped a switch and suddenly the labor, the planning, the migration, the big public projects, all of it accelerates. We'll get into that surge in a moment, but even before we do, I want to underline the emotional reality of it. Imagine arriving. You've lived your whole life in smaller villages, places where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest structure might be a community building, a modest mound, maybe a palisade if things are tense. And then you walk toward this place. You see mounds rising like steps to the sky. You see a plaza so wide it changes the way sound travels. You see crowds. You see strangers. You see styles of pottery that aren't yours. You hear languages you don't speak. That can be exciting. It can also be terrifying. Cities do that. Cities promise opportunity and swallow privacy at the same time. And cities always create social layers because you can't pack that many people together without someone deciding who gets the best space, who gets access, who gets to distribute food, who gets to interpret the gods, who gets to punish. So even in this opening act, before we talk about sacrifices, before we talk about walls, before we talk about collapse, there's already a tension in the landscape. A plaza can be a gathering place. It can also be a stage. A mound can be a temple platform. It can also be a power platform. And that's why I called this the ghost in the cornfields. Not because Cahokia is spooky in a cheap way, but because the past here doesn't behave like the past in most American imagination. It doesn't sit politely behind museum glass. It interrupts you. It makes you rethink what American history even means. We usually start that story with colonies and founding fathers. Sometimes, if we're feeling generous, we mention Native Americans as a kind of preface, like a prologue before the real narrative begins. But Cahokia isn't a prologue. Cahokia is a main event. And if you accept that, the implications spread outward. Because Cahokia isn't just one mound, or even just one site. It sits inside a larger tradition of mound-building societies in the eastern woodlands and the Mississippi Valley, with roots and branches that stretch across centuries. Cahokia is a peak, an explosive concentration of population and power, but it's connected to wider networks, to older practices, to trade routes that carried shells from distant coasts and stone from far quarries and ideas across huge distances. This is the part where the wilderness myth really falls apart, not with an argument, but with logistics. Networks imply regular contact. Contact implies diplomacy, rivalry, exchange, marriage ties, migration. And you don't get a metropolis without an agricultural base strong enough to support it. Here, maize, corn, becomes not just a crop, but a kind of engine. It's hard to overstate what reliable calories do to a society. If you can produce surplus, you can support specialists. If you can support specialists, you can have full-time builders, full-time religious leaders, full-time craftspeople, full-time political organizers. Surplus buys you time. Time buys you complexity. Complexity buys you monuments. And monuments, in turn, reinforce the system. They tell everyone, every day, that this order is real, that it's bigger than the individual, that it's backed by the sacred. So when you stand in modern Cahokia and you see cornfields all around, that's not just an ironic visual, it's a clue. Corn is part of the story in the most literal sense. The crop that defines the Midwest today is also woven into the rise of this ancient city. Different varieties, different techniques, different social worlds, but the same basic fact. Agriculture made density possible. Now, I'm going to do something I like to do as a storyteller when the timeline is about to get crowded. I'm going to pause and zoom out so we don't lose the thread. The mound we're looking at took work across multiple building episodes. The city around it changed over time. This wasn't one single moment frozen in amber. It was a living place, with politics that shifted, with leaders who rose and fell, with rituals that evolved. But there is a moment right around the middle of the 11th century when the whole system seems to surge. And that surge is what we're heading toward. Because once you understand that the city didn't just slowly drift into being, but instead seems to have been, at some point, actively and rapidly made, planned spaces, coordinated construction, people arriving in waves, then Cahokia stops being a mystery mound site and starts looking like a deliberate project. And when you say deliberate project, you're basically saying someone had a vision. Maybe not one person in the Hollywood sense, not a lone genius with a blueprint, but a leadership class, a religious center, a coalition of elites, somebody with the authority to mobilize labor, to feed workers, to organize space, to keep the peace or enforce it. So here, at the edge of the cornfields, with the modern world pressing in from every direction, you can almost feel the moment before the curtain rises. The stage is set, the giant mound is in front of you, the plaza is waiting. And somewhere in the year 1050, a city begins to assemble itself at a speed that still makes historians argue in low, excited voices. Let's step into that moment and watch it happen. All right, so if you buy the idea that Cahokia is a real city and not just a collection of random mounds, the next question comes fast. How did this happen, and why here, and why so quickly? Because what makes Cahokia different from a lot of other ancient places is that it doesn't look like it simply drifted into being over 1,000 years of slow, sleepy growth. Archaeologists see something more abrupt around the middle of the 11th century, right around 1050, when the whole American bottom region seems to reorganize politically, economically, socially, and central Cahokia gets built out in a planned way, like someone cleared their throat and said, "We're doing this now." And I want you to imagine what that means in human terms, because planned construction can sound sterile, like a city planning document, but in real life it means people made hard choices, it means families moved, it means old villages were left behind, it means fields were reassigned. It means somebody had enough authority or enough spiritual pull or enough alliances to convince a lot of people to stop living the way they'd been living and start living in a new pattern. The USGS even describes this early Mississippian shift, the Loman phase, as a transformation that included a large influx of people into downtown Cahokia, the abandonment of earlier village settlements, and a reorganization of farming in the floodplain and uplands. That's not a minor adjustment. That's society turning over like soil. Now, when people hear 1050, they sometimes picture a single year, like fireworks on January 1st, and suddenly a metropolis appears. Real history is messier. It's more like a decade or two where everything accelerates, and if you were alive then, you might not even recognize the scale of what you were part of until you looked up one day and realized your world had changed. But still, compared to the centuries before it, this period looks like a surge, and scholars have even used the phrase Mississippian Big Bang to talk about it. So what's the engine behind a surge like that? There isn't one single answer, and I want to be honest about that. We're reading clues. We see patterns. Population concentrates. Monumental construction ramps up. A central precinct takes shape with broad plazas and major mounds, and the whole place starts behaving like a magnet. But magnets can pull for different reasons. Sometimes it's opportunity. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's faith. Sometimes it's all of them braided together so tightly that you can't separate them afterward. One of the simplest, least romantic answers is food. A city can't exist unless its landscape can feed it. In this region, maize agriculture becomes more intensive and reliable over time, and that matters because surplus calories aren't just more meals, they're political power. Surplus is what lets you support builders who aren't farming full-time, and priests who aren't hunting, and craftspeople who aren't in the fields all day. Surplus is what lets you call people into the center for a project and keep them there. And around Cahokia, that agricultural system seems to get reorganized in the same window when the city is expanding. Farming in the floodplain, farming in the uplands, a bigger machine to keep a bigger center alive. But food alone doesn't explain why people would leave older communities and move into a dense urban core where disease spreads faster, where privacy shrinks, where the social pressure is constant. Cities aren't just convenient, they're demanding. So the other engine, maybe the more powerful one, is meaning, belief, a shared story that makes the inconvenience feel worth it. When you look at Cahokia's central precinct, with its huge leveled plazas and carefully placed mounds, it reads like a stage for ceremony, for authority, for public life. Even summaries of the site emphasize the highly planned nature of those plazas in their relationship to the mounds, which suggests something like a central pilgrimage and political place, not just a big neighborhood that happened by accident. And if you've ever been to a major religious center anywhere in the world, you know how quickly people will travel, relocate, reorganize their lives around a place they believe is powerful. Now let's zoom in, and I'm going to do it like a storyteller, not like a textbook. Picture a network of villages scattered through the river valleys and upland edges. People know the seasonal rhythms. They plant, they harvest, they trade, they marry across communities. They feud sometimes, they make peace, they bury their dead. Then, in this period around 1050, something begins to concentrate. Maybe a new religious movement takes hold. Maybe leaders in the region form a coalition. Maybe a powerful lineage rises and is able to attract followers. Maybe there's a crisis somewhere else, flooding, conflict, a burned-out settlement that makes the big center feel safer or more stable. We have hints of big events in the wider region, but even without a single cinematic trigger, the end result is visible. People move in. They don't just visit, they relocate. Whole household clusters appear, and downtown Cahokia starts to look like an intentional creation. This is where the phrase "out of nowhere" is tempting, because it feels dramatic, but it's a little unfair to the centuries of groundwork that made the moment possible. Cahokia didn't come from nothing. There were earlier mound-building traditions in the region, and there were communities already living there. What's new is the scale and the speed and the level of coordination. It's like the difference between a few neighborhood bands and suddenly an orchestra with a conductor playing a piece everyone seems to know. Now, how do you see coordination in the dirt? Not because we find a city charter carved in stone, there is no stone charter, but because the space itself is organized. The mounds and plazas aren't just scattered, they relate to one another. The central plaza is enormous and intentionally leveled. Major mounds anchor the edges of that open space. Movement through the precinct would have been guided by pathways, courtyards, and visibility lines. Who can see whom? Who can approach which platform? Who can stand in the plaza and look up at the summit of Monk's Mound and feel small? And that's the thing. Planning isn't only about efficiency. Planning is also about social psychology. It's about turning landscape into hierarchy. When a society builds a downtown, it builds a message. And the message at Cahokia is not subtle. Power lives here. The sacred lives here. If you want to be part of the center, you come to the center. You can feel it in the sheer labor implied. Even conservative descriptions talk about thousands of workers moving enormous volumes of earth in basket loads over decades, shaping a whole network of mounds and plazas. And let's linger on the labor for a second, because it's easy to say thousands of workers and keep walking. But labor is never just labor. Labor means organization. It means scheduling. It means provisioning. People need food and water while they work. It means authority. Someone decides where the fill comes from, where it goes, how steep a slope should be. What happens if somebody refuses? It also means community, because people don't show up in large numbers unless they're compelled or inspired, and usually it's a mix. Think of modern analogies. Sometimes people build massive things because they believe in them. Sometimes they build because they have no choice. Sometimes the line between those two is blurry, especially when religion and politics are intertwined. Cahokia sits right in that blurry space, and the Big Bang idea is really about that moment when the machine locks into gear. Agriculture supporting density, density supporting specialization, specialization supporting monumental building, monumental building reinforcing authority, authority drawing in more people. Feedback loops, basically, the kind that can turn a region into a civilization. There's another layer here that I think is important for an American audience because it helps break one of our default assumptions. We tend to imagine ancient societies as isolated. A village here, another village there, maybe occasional contact. But Cahokia's rise is also tied to networks, movement of goods, movement of people, movement of ideas. Some researchers even frame Cahokia as a kind of melting pot, with immigrants coming from different communities into the city during its boom years, which makes sense if it's a magnet center. If you're building something enormous, you need not just hands, but skills. People who know how to manage soil, how to align posts, how to organize public events, how to craft the symbols of legitimacy. And symbols matter. In a city growing that fast, you're constantly managing strangers. You can't run a metropolis on personal relationships alone. You need shared rituals, shared calendars, shared public performances that remind everyone again and again that the same order holds. That's why when people talk about Cahokia, they don't only talk about mounds, they talk about plazas. They talk about alignment. They talk about Woodhenge, those rings of posts that work like a solar calendar. Because a calendar is more than astronomy. A calendar is social control in the gentle sense. It tells you when to gather, when to plant, when to celebrate, when the world is turning. And for a city trying to hold itself together, synchronized time is a kind of glue. Now, I don't want to turn this into a fairy tale of progress, because the story of Cahokia is not a clean rise of civilization montage. It's human, which means it's beautiful and messy and at times brutal. But even before we reach the darker evidence, the rapid boom itself raises a question that should make you pause. What does it feel like to live through a boom you can't fully explain? Imagine you're a teenager in one of the outlying settlements. One year, you're playing a game in a small plaza near your home. The next year, your relatives are talking about moving closer to the big center. People are leaving. New people are arriving. There's talk of ceremonies. There's talk of a leader you've never seen, or a priesthood, or a new sacred order. Then suddenly, you're walking in a place where crowds are normal, where construction never stops, where the skyline is changing. That kind of transformation creates momentum, but it also creates anxiety. Because when everything is being rebuilt, the rules are being rewritten too. And that's why I keep coming back to the idea that this wasn't just growth, it was a reorganization, a reshaping of how people related to land, to each other, and to power. If you want one concrete way to feel the difference between slow growth and big bang, it's this. Slow growth tends to preserve older layouts. It's additive, it's incremental. The Big Bang moment looks more like a reset. Older settlement patterns diminish, the center is formalized, and the urban core becomes something like a blueprint made real. And by the way, blueprint doesn't mean paper. It means shared knowledge. It means practice. It means people who can look at a landscape and think in straight lines and measured distances. People who can coordinate multiple crews. People who understand not just how to pile earth, but how to shape it so it lasts. Even the way Monk's Mound was built, different fills, clays, soils, stabilizing strategies, the constant battle against slumping and water, suggests they were not guessing. They were learning, adjusting, engineering. And that right there is where the story gets almost intimate, because it brings you close to the hands. We tend to picture ancient monuments as timeless, but the people building them were working with immediate problems: rain, erosion, fatigue, politics, deadlines set by ritual calendars, the need to impress, the need to keep legitimacy alive. A mound is not just a monument, it's a project you have to keep under control, because if it fails, if it slumps, if it collapses, if it looks wrong, it's not only an engineering failure, it's a social failure. It's the gods frowning. It's your leadership looking weak. So when Cahokia expands quickly, you're watching a society take on risk knowingly. You're watching them bet on a future where the city holds. And for a while, that bet pays off. The center becomes grand enough that even today, standing on Monk's Mound, you can feel the intended effect. You are above the world. You are looking out over a landscape that has been made to reflect an order. The prairie turns into a map of power, and the Big Bang of 1050 is the moment the map begins to draw itself, fast, confident, almost daring. So with that in mind, this sudden surge, this planned downtown, this influx of people, now we can finally do what every good historian eventually has to do: stop admiring the silhouette and start asking how it was built. Literally, basket by basket, layer by layer, with no wheel and no draft animals, just human coordination and an idea strong enough to move dirt into a pyramid. Let's do the most basic thought experiment in the world. Pretend you've been put in charge of building Monk's Mound, and then somebody takes away everything you're used to leaning on. No steel shovels, no draft animals, no wagons, no wheelbarrows, no cranes. You've got wood, stone, bone, fiber, baskets, and a whole lot of human backs. And then you look at the job, a flat-topped earthen pyramid about 100 feet high with a base that sprawls across roughly 14 to 15 acres, rising in terraces like a giant stepped platform. Even the numbers are hard to hold in your head. Different estimates exist, but you're talking about tens of millions of cubic feet of earth moved by hand, basket by basket. And right there is the first point I want to make, because people hear earthen mound and their brain files it under pile of dirt. But dirt is not obedient. Dirt slumps. Dirt drinks water. Dirt slides when it's saturated. Dirt cracks when it dries. Dirt erodes. If you just heap it up, gravity will teach you a lesson. So what Cahokia built here wasn't a pile. It was an engineered landform, a piece of architecture made out of soils. Now, how do you engineer with soil? You do it the way good builders always do, by thinking in layers, by learning what material behaves how, and by building in episodes instead of trying to do everything in one mad sprint. One of the things researchers have argued based on coring and excavation is that Monk's Mound wasn't thrown up in a single continuous effort. It was expanded and modified through multiple construction stages over time. That sounds technical, but it's actually very human. It's a city growing, changing, revising its skyline, and reinvesting in the same sacred centerpiece again and again. And each episode means planning, where the fill comes from, how it's carried, who's working, who's feeding the workers, how you keep the slopes stable, how you get water away from the mass of the mound before it turns into a slow-motion mudslide. Speaking of fill, we have decent evidence that Cahokian builders used different kinds of soils and clays and even sod in particular ways, not randomly, almost like a recipe. Clay can be a blessing and a curse. Packed clay can act like a kind of seal, slowing water movement, but it can also become slick when wet, and that's where the mound's long-term struggle shows up, slumping. There's evidence and discussion in the literature about slumps on Monk's Mound, parts of the structure sagging and sliding over time, especially on the western side, and how later building choices may have been responding to that problem. And I love this detail because it's the opposite of the mystical ancient builders who never make mistakes trope. Of course they had structural problems. Of course the mound fought back. When you're stacking a small mountain of earth, water is always your enemy, and gravity is always waiting. So the engineering story of Monk's Mound is, in a quiet way, a story of persistence, builders confronting the same stubborn physics we deal with today, just with different tools and different assumptions about what's at stake. And there's another layer here that doesn't get talked about enough: logistics. Even if you understand soils perfectly, you still have to move them. Think about the simplest unit of work, a basket load. Fill a basket, carry it, dump it, go back. Now multiply that by millions. This is not the kind of job you do with a few volunteers showing up on weekends. This requires an organized labor force and a system to keep that labor force alive and coordinated. And coordination is a kind of invisible technology. It's schedules, it's crews, it's supervisors, it's rules, it's probably songs and rhythms to keep people moving together. It's also authority, because at some point somebody is deciding that today you're not tending your own plot. Today you're part of a public project, and the community is going to feed you while you work. When you hear no wheel, don't think primitive, think different engineering problem. Wheels are great on roads. The American bottom is a floodplain. It's wet, it's soft, it changes. In a saturated landscape, 1,000 human feet and 1,000 baskets can actually beat a cart that bogs down. So Cahokia's technology wasn't missing, it was adapted. Now climb the mound in your mind for a second. The structure rises in terraces, and on top there was once a large building, probably a temple, or the residence of the paramount leader, or both, because in a place like this, politics and religion aren't separate departments. Imagine what that looked like from the Grand Plaza, a broad, open civic space, and at the edge of it, this platform rising like the seat of the world. Whoever stood up there could be seen from far away. Whoever lived up there lived inside a constant performance. And performance is not decoration, it's governance. But I don't want to float away into symbolism and forget the nuts and bolts, because the physical act of getting onto that summit mattered too. You don't just build a mound and then shrug. People had to access it, carry materials up it, hold ceremonies on it. There were routes, ramps, stairways, controlled approaches, ways of moving that also told you who belonged up there and who didn't. The mound itself becomes a filter. It separates the everyday from the sacred, the many from the few, the plaza from the summit. And the craziest part is that this engineered landscape was built without the kinds of tools we reflexively associate with civilization, which says more about our assumptions than it does about them. Because what you're really seeing at Monk's Mound is not a lack of technology. You're seeing a different technological package: soil knowledge, communal labor systems, agricultural surplus, and a shared belief strong enough to keep the whole thing going through multiple building phases. There's a quiet tragedy baked into the engineering story too, and it's this: the mound's problems didn't begin yesterday. Slumping and erosion aren't modern insults, they're part of the mound's life history. And later builders likely had to respond to those issues, sometimes adding terraces or reworking faces to stabilize what was already starting to move. So when we talk about the genius of Cahokia, it's not just that they built big, it's that they maintained big. They kept returning to the same center and investing more labor into it, which tells you the mound wasn't a one-time stunt. It was the axis of a living system. And if you're listening closely, that engineering story is already hinting at what comes later in our narrative. Because when a society pours this much labor into monuments, it's making a promise. The world order will last, the center will hold, the gods will favor the city. But monumental promises are fragile in their own way. They require constant renewal of authority, of food supply, of social peace, of belief. For now, in this golden window, the promise is working. Monk's Mound stands, the plaza fills, the city hums. And once you accept the mound as a piece of engineering rather than a curiosity, you're ready for the next step. What it actually felt like to live around it, day after day, in a place that ran on corn, ceremony, trade, and the strange electricity of being part of something enormous. Imagine you wake up before sunrise, not in a lonely cabin or a scattered hamlet, but in a neighborhood where other households are close enough that you can hear somebody coughing 2 walls away. You can hear a baby fussing. You can hear the first steps of people heading out into the cool air with baskets and tools. Smoke is already curling from a few hearths because someone always wakes early. The ground under your feet is packed hard from thousands of footsteps, and when you look toward the center of the world, your world, you see it, the broad, open stretch of the Grand Plaza, and beyond it, the mounds rising like man-made hills with flat tops, and above all of it, Monk's Mound, sitting there like the city's spine. This is the part of Cahokia that gets lost when we only talk about engineering. Engineering is the bones, but a city is the blood and breath. A city is noise, routine, gossip, trade, the small humiliations, the small joys. It's people getting on each other's nerves. It's kids playing games in the dust. It's somebody trying to impress somebody else. It's arguments over food. It's celebrations when the harvest is good. It's fear when the weather turns weird. And Cahokia, at its height, would have felt like a place that never really went quiet. Not the way a small village does at night. Even if the central precinct had rules, areas you didn't wander into, times you didn't speak loudly, there's still that low city hum, the sense that you are always surrounded by other lives. Now let's talk about what you would actually see if you walked from the outer neighborhoods toward the center. You'd pass houses made mostly of wood and thatch, some set around small open spaces, some clustered more tightly, the kind of buildings that don't survive 1,000 years in the air, which is why archaeology has to catch them in the soil. Post holes, stains, patterns that say, yes, here was a wall, here was a doorway, here was a fire pit. The houses are not palaces. Most people are not elites. Most people are doing what most humans do in every society, trying to keep their families fed, trying to stay healthy, trying to get through winter, trying to keep the peace with neighbors, trying to keep their standing in the community without getting crushed by the community's expectations. And in Cahokia, the daily rhythm would revolve around one thing more than almost anything else: corn. Maize is not just a food, it's a system. It's calories you can store. It's a crop that can feed a lot of people per acre if managed well. It's the difference between everyone being spread out and everyone being able to cluster. When people call Cahokia a metropolis, that word is standing on a foundation of cornfields, granaries, work parties, seasonal labor, and probably constant anxiety about weather. Because surplus sounds comfortable until you realize surplus is also what gets taxed, what gets redistributed, what gets controlled by whoever has authority. If you want to understand how a city like this holds together, don't start with temples. Start with storage. Start with who holds the food when the harvest comes in. Now you enter the open space of the Grand Plaza, and it's hard to describe how psychologically different a huge plaza feels compared to a small village clearing. Big open space changes behavior, it changes sound, it changes what a crowd feels like. In a plaza like this, you can gather thousands of people, and suddenly politics becomes theater, ritual becomes theater, authority becomes visible. When a leader appears on a mound top, everybody can see. When a ceremony begins, everybody can hear the drums, see the movement, feel the tension in the crowd as the moment builds. And that's the key. In a large city, you can't rely on everyone personally knowing the chief or the priest. So you rely on moments that make people feel united, or at least synchronized. Feasts are perfect for that. Picture the smell of roasting meat, stew pots, piles of food brought in from outside, and not just for nutrition. Feasts are messages. A feast says the center can provide. The center is generous. The center is powerful enough to gather resources and hand them back out. And if you're in the crowd eating, you're not just getting calories, you're participating in a relationship. You're accepting the order of things. But feasts also reveal inequality, because who eats first? Who eats what? Who sits near the front? Who is allowed close to the mound? Who gets the best cuts, the rare items, the symbolic foods? And then, because humans are humans, who resents it? Who pretends not to resent it? Who whispers about it later in the neighborhood? That's city life too. One of the best ways to bring the place alive is to think of Cahokia not as one big, undifferentiated crowd, but as layers. On one end, you have common households, farmers, hunters, people gathering firewood, people building and repairing houses, making pottery, raising children, tending small gardens, keeping tools sharp. Their world is practical, but it's not simple. Their calendar is complex. Planting, weeding, harvest, hunting cycles, maintenance, preparing for winter, and then the public schedule layered on top. Days you're expected in the plaza, days you're expected to help with construction, days you're expected to show up for ceremonies that may be the only time you see the elite up close. On the other end, you have the people living and operating at the top of the mounds or in the structures near the central precinct. Leaders, high-status lineages, religious specialists, maybe administrators, the people who coordinate labor and ritual and distribution. They live in a different world, not because they're a different species, but because space itself gives them a different life. If you live near the center, you're near information. You hear news sooner. You know who is rising, who is falling. You see the goods that arrive from far away. You have better access to feasts and rituals. You also live under a spotlight. Power is never relaxing. Power is a performance you have to maintain, and the mound tops are basically stages. Now let's talk about play, because play is how a city reveals itself. There's a game associated with Cahokia that people love mentioning because it's so vivid, chunky. Picture a smooth stone disc rolled across a flat space, and players throwing long spears, trying to predict where the disc will stop, aiming not just for skill, but for that strange mix of physics and luck. It's competitive, it's social, and it can be high stakes. Games like that can be entertainment, but they can also be rituals, and they can also be a way to settle disputes, a way to display status, a way to gamble, a way to pull the community into one shared moment. And in a place like Cahokia, where you have big public spaces intentionally built for gatherings, it's hard not to imagine Chunky played in front of crowds, with shouting and laughter, with people pushing closer, with someone important watching from a vantage point. That's the thing about the Grand Plaza. It's not just an empty yard, it's a social machine. It's where you see the city being a city. Now, a lot of people want a clean, cinematic day in the life, so let's do it, but we'll do it honestly, with a little mess in it. Morning, you're working. If it's planting season, you're in fields, and those fields might be outside the densest part of the city, because you can't farm on top of houses. If it's harvest, you're hauling. If it's winter, you're repairing, hunting, processing stored food, making tools, dealing with sickness, dealing with smoke in enclosed spaces, dealing with cramped living. Midday, trade and movement. Cahokia is not self-contained. Goods come in, people come in. This is a hub. You'd see materials you don't get locally. Shells, special stones, copper, fancy ceramics, items that carry more than utility. They carry meaning. They say, I have connections, I have access, I have the kind of status where distant things can find their way to my hands. And this matters because cities run on flows. Flows of food, flows of raw materials, flows of information, flows of people. Afternoon, maybe you're called for labor on a public project. Not every day, but often enough that it's part of life. You might be hauling earth, cutting posts, carrying bundles of wood. You might be participating in something that feels communal and uplifting, or something that feels exhausting and imposed. It could be both in the same week. Evening, cooking, storytelling, small rituals, local gatherings, maybe an announcement that tomorrow is a big day at the plaza, maybe news that someone died, maybe tension because a leader demands more tribute, maybe excitement because traders arrived and there's something to see. And then Night. The city is darker than our city, but it's not dead. People move, dogs bark, fires glow, and above all of it, the sky is huge, and the sky matters. Because for Cahokia, the sky is not just scenery, it's part of the system. The movement of the sun and seasons is tied to planting and harvest, yes, but also to ceremony, to legitimacy, to the idea that the city's order is aligned with the world's order. When you think of City of the Sun, don't imagine a nickname invented for tourists. Imagine a place where leadership and ritual are constantly trying to say, we understand the cosmos, we can keep time, we can keep the world in balance, and this city is the proof. Now, I want to be careful here, because it's very tempting to romanticize Cahokia as some harmonious, enlightened utopia. Astronomers, engineers, peaceful farmers, everyone living in cosmic balance. That's not how human societies work. Large populations create friction, centralized power creates resentment, surplus creates inequality, and the city's beauty, its plazas, its mounds, its ceremonies, can coexist with real hardship. People's bodies tell us that in many ancient societies, including this region, health could be uneven. Diets heavy in maize can be productive, but they can also lead to nutritional problems if not balanced with enough protein and micronutrients. Dense settlements can mean more disease, and when you scale up, small problems become big ones: waste, water, conflict, leadership crises. So when we picture a citizen walking across the Grand Plaza, we should picture not just awe, but fatigue, not just pride, but worry, not just community, but surveillance, because central precincts often come with social control. If you're on the margins, the center might feel like opportunity. It might also feel like something that watches you. And that's where the mounds are important again, not as architecture, but as psychology. When a small group can look down on the plaza from a high platform, it creates a sense of order. It creates a sense of above and below. Even if nobody is literally standing there every minute, the structure itself is a reminder. It tells you where authority lives. It tells you which direction to face during a ceremony. It tells you what matters. And in everyday life, that kind of constant reminder can shape behavior in subtle ways. Where you walk, what you say, how you dress for a public event, how you teach your children to behave when they're near the center. Now, one more thing, because it's easy to forget, cities are emotional. People fall in love, people cheat, people make friends, people get lonely in crowds, people form rivalries, people chase status, people grieve. In a place like Cahokia, you'd have marriages connecting lineages, alliances built through kinship, feasts that double as political negotiation, craft guild-like groups sharing techniques, spiritual specialists mentoring apprentices, and probably plenty of ordinary drama, disputes over boundaries, accusations, envy, jokes about the elite, fear of punishment, hope for good harvests. And that's what makes the city feel real to me. It's not the mound silhouette, it's the human texture. So when I say life in the City of the Sun, what I'm really saying is stop picturing Cahokia as a mystery monument and start picturing it as a crowded human place where power and belief and food and fun were tangled together. Because once you see that, once you can hear the plaza, once you can smell the cooking fires, once you can imagine a chunky stone rolling across packed earth, then the next parts of the story land differently. Woodhenge won't feel like a random curiosity. It will feel like something a city like this would build because it needs to keep time, keep ritual, keep the crowd synchronized. And the darker discoveries later on won't feel like they come out of nowhere either. They'll feel like the shadow that can form whenever a human system gets big enough, confident enough, and hungry enough to believe it has the right to command not just labor, but lives. Okay, so here's the thing I always want people to feel about Cahokia. It wasn't only built to impress the eye. It was built to answer a question. Where are we in time, and how do we stay in step with the powers that run the world? And that's where Woodhenge comes in, because Woodhenge is one of those discoveries that flips the whole mood of the site. You go from, wow, they built big, to, oh, they were watching the sky on purpose with a system. What archaeologists found west of Monk's Mound were these huge circular patterns of post holes, timber circles, set out with a kind of stubborn regularity, like someone measured the spacing again and again to make sure it stayed true. The circles weren't all the same either. There were multiple versions built over time, and as the city changed, the circles changed too, getting larger, adding more posts, overlapping in the same general area, as if each new generation was updating the instrument rather than abandoning it. The story of how it was discovered is very unromantic in a way that I actually love. Highway construction, salvage archaeology, the kind of frantic, we have to record this before it's gone work that so often sits behind the most beautiful finds. In the early 1960s, Warren Witry and others start noticing these odd, large post pits, and when they map them, they realize they aren't random house posts, they're arcs. Then the arcs start to suggest circles. And once you get the circle in your head, you can't unsee it. Because a circle like that is a statement. It says, this is a place meant to be stood in, looked out from, used. So Witry floats the idea, what if this is a solar calendar? What if it's built to mark the year? And that's where the evidence begins to line up with the sky itself, because certain posts correspond to where the sun rises at key moments, summer solstice, winter solstice, and the equinoxes, those hinge points of the agricultural year when everybody needs to know, down to the week, what season you're entering. And let me slow down here, because solar calendar can sound like a tidy label, and it was probably more than that. Think about what a city needs. A city needs coordination. You can't get tens of thousands of people to move together physically, ritually, politically, unless you've got shared time. Not just, it's morning, but this is the day, this is the season, this is the moment when the world turns and we do what our ancestors taught us to do. Woodhenge is time made visible. It's time turned into architecture. Now, the part that really makes your skin tingle when you hear it for the first time is the equinox alignment. From the center of one of these timber circles, on the spring or fall equinox, the sun rises due east, and from that vantage point, it can appear to come up in line with Monk's Mound in the distance, like the city is staging the sunrise, like it's saying, watch this, the world is ordered, and we sit inside the order. It's not hard to imagine a crowd gathered for that, not because it's pretty, although it is, but because it carries authority. If leaders and religious specialists can predict the sun's behavior and anchor ceremonies to it, that's not just astronomy, that's legitimacy. It tells people the center knows what it's doing. It tells them the city is in tune with the cosmos. And in a Mississippian world, that kind of tuning isn't a hobby, it's survival. The planting cycle is real, the hunger cycle is real, winter is real, floods are real. So when a community builds a structure that can help them keep the calendar straight, they're building reassurance into the landscape. And it's not just reassurance for farmers, it's reassurance for the political system, because ceremonial timing is also how you manage power. You choose when crowds assemble. You choose when tribute is delivered. You choose when public feasts happen. You choose when alliances are renewed and rivalries are cooled down or inflamed. Now, what exactly did Woodhenge look like in practice? Picture tall wooden posts. Some sources talk about cedar being used, a wood that carries sacred weight in many native traditions and also happens to be resistant to decay, so it makes sense on multiple levels. The posts are set in a circle, and there's usually a central point where an observer could stand, then use specific marker posts on the perimeter to watch where the sun rises across the year. It's simple in concept, but not simple in execution, because the spacing has to be consistent, the lines of sight have to be tested, and the whole thing has to be maintained. And it's not a small backyard circle either. Some of these circles are hundreds of feet across and involve dozens of posts. The fact that there were multiple circles, Woodhenge I through V in the standard labeling, tells you it wasn't a one-off experiment. It was an institutional tool. It was part of the city's functioning. And here's a detail that feels almost quietly tragic. By the time you get to the later versions, archaeologists think one of the circles may not have been completed as a full ring, and one suggested reason is simply resource pressure. Big, straight trees are not infinite, especially when a whole metropolis is also building houses, palisades, temples, ramps, and everything else out of wood. That's one of those moments where the cosmic and the practical meet. You can have grand religious ideas, but you still need timber, you still need labor, you still need the landscape to keep paying the bill. Now let's widen the lens a little, because Woodhenge as calendar is the doorway, but what's inside the room is Cahokia's worldview, how the city understood reality. Across a lot of Mississippian iconography and tradition, as we can reconstruct it, you see a layered universe, an upper world associated with sky powers, a middle world where humans live, and an underworld or beneath world tied to water, chaos, fertility, danger, the things below the surface. I want to be careful and respectful here because we're talking about spiritual frameworks that lived in real communities and still echo in descendant communities. And we're also talking about scholarly reconstruction from material evidence, not a neat written theology. But as a storyteller, I can tell you this. The three-layered cosmos is a useful way to understand why Cahokia builds what it builds. A mound is not just a platform, it's an axis. It rises, it points up, it creates above. A plaza is not just empty space, it's the stage of the middle world, where humans gather and witness order. And then below, burials, pits, offerings, waterlogged spaces, the unseen. The beneath world is always there, even if you don't speak its name out loud. Woodhenge fits into that because it's literally about the sky. It's a machine for watching the sun, yes, but it's also a ritual theater for connecting human time to cosmic time. And once you think of it that way, you start seeing Cahokia not as a random city that happened to get big, but as a city built as a mirror of a universe, carefully arranged, symbolically charged, and constantly reinforced through ceremony. That's why alignment matters. Alignments aren't just cool, they're persuasive. They let leaders say, the order we enforce on earth reflects the order in the heavens. Now, take one more step into the human side of it, because I don't want this to float away into abstraction. Imagine being an ordinary person in Cahokia and hearing that tomorrow is a sunrise day. You may not know the geometry, you may not care about the math, but you know the feeling. People will gather early. There will be movement toward the circle, there will be a hush before the horizon brightens, and there will be that moment when the sun hits the marker and the crowd reacts. not because they're surprised the sun exists, but because the timing is right, because the ceremony lands, because everyone can feel the year turning together. And in a city, that togetherness is priceless. It knits strangers into a single audience. It reminds people they belong to the same calendar, the same story, the same center. It also reminds them, gently or not, who controls that story. Because somebody decides where you stand. Somebody decides who stands in the center. Somebody decides who speaks when the sun appears. And that's why Woodhenge, for me, is one of the clearest examples of Cahokia's brilliance, and also, quietly, its danger. The brilliance is the sophistication, building a precise observational device out of timber and earth in a floodplain metropolis and integrating it into civic life. The danger is what any sacred machine can become when it's fused to political power, a way to make authority feel natural, cosmic, inevitable. If the leaders can say, look, the sun rises where we say it rises, at the time we say it rises, and the city's rituals fit the heavens, then resisting the leaders can start to feel like resisting the universe. That's a heavy thought. And I'm not claiming that's exactly how every Cahokian felt. I'm saying the architecture creates the possibility. It sets the stage for a society where belief and governance reinforce each other, where the calendar isn't only about planting, but about obedience, belonging, and hierarchy. And here's the final point I want to leave hanging in the air before we move on. Woodhenge tells us Cahokia didn't just grow outward, it looked upward, it watched, it tracked, it cared about precision, which means the city's center was not only a market or a fortress or a cluster of houses, it was a place where people tried to keep the world in balance. And when you have a society that sees itself as responsible for cosmic balance, when it sees itself as the hinge between worlds, that can create incredible unity. It can also create incredible pressure. And if you're building a story about rise and collapse, about a city that burns bright and then unravels, pressure is never a small detail. There's a moment in every excavation story when the ground stops being soil and starts being a message. And at Cahokia, that moment lives in the area archaeologists call Mound 72. On the surface, it doesn't look like much compared to Monk's Mound. No towering silhouette, no grand staircase for tourists. It's lower, quieter, the kind of place you could walk past if you didn't know. But this is where the city speaks in a different voice, not the voice of engineering, the voice of belief and power, and the costs that come with them. Mound 72 is part of a larger sacred landscape, and what makes it so haunting is how deliberate it feels, how staged. Burials here weren't simply people died and were placed in the ground. They were arranged, oriented, built into a sequence of construction episodes, like the mound itself was being used as a script that unfolded over time. And inside that script is one of the most famous and most misunderstood discoveries at Cahokia, the beaded burial, sometimes called the Birdman burial. Archaeologists found an elite individual laid out on a bed of marine shell disc beads, about 10,000 of them, carefully arranged into the shape of a falcon, wings spread, as if the person was resting on an emblem rather than on earth. Just pause and try to picture the labor behind that for a second. 10,000 beads doesn't happen casually. Those shells have to come from somewhere far away. They have to be worked, shaped, drilled, smoothed. Someone has to have the time, the skill, and the social permission to do that work instead of planting corn or hauling wood. And then someone has to decide that when this person dies or is made to die, we can't always know the story behind the moment, the burial will be an event, not private grief, public meaning, an image laid into the ground meant to be remembered. Now, the Birdman itself matters. In Mississippian art and symbolism, there's this recurring figure, a warrior or supernatural being often tied to falcon imagery, sometimes called the Birdman, connected to themes of power, conflict, rank, and the sky world. You see echoes of it across the broader Mississippian world, later called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex by scholars. But Cahokia is one of the places where that visual language feels early, central, almost foundational. So when you find a burial literally placed on a falcon-shaped field of beads, it doesn't read like decoration. It reads like a political theology. Like the city is saying, this person is not just important, this person is cosmically important. This person is aligned with the powers above. And here's where the story gets even more human and a little more complicated, because later analysis has pushed back on the old simple version of the tale. For years, people repeated it like a clean legend, a powerful man, the Birdman, buried in splendor. But more recent scholarship suggests the burial included both male and female remains, which changes the mood completely. It shifts the story from a lone hero to something more layered, maybe a paired elite burial, maybe a ritual representation, maybe a statement about lineage and legitimacy, not just one individual's status. And that's the thing about Cahokia. Just when you think you've got the story pinned down, the evidence nudges you and says, not so fast. Now stand back from the beads and the symbol and look at the wider setting of Mound 72. This mound area seems tied to alignment and timing, posts and sightlines that connect burials to solar directions in ways that feel intentional, like the dead were being placed into the same cosmic order the living watched from Woodhenge. So we're not just looking at a grave, we're looking at a ritual landscape where death, authority, and the sky are braided together. And if you're wondering why I'm spending so much time here, it's because Mound 72 is where the golden image of Cahokia, astronomers, plazas, games, feasts, starts to pick up its shadow. A society that can create a burial like this has extraordinary capacity, craftsmanship, long-distance connections, organization, and a belief system strong enough to choreograph the end of a human life into a symbol. But that same capacity can be used in harder ways. And right next to the splendor, in the very same mound, the ground holds evidence that forces us to speak more quietly and more carefully about what this city demanded from people who didn't live on top of mounds. There are places in history where you can feel the temperature drop, even if you're standing in full sun. And Mound 72 is one of those places for me, because once you get past the beadwork and the iconography, the ground starts telling a harder story, one that doesn't ask for our admiration so much as our attention, and maybe our quiet. Excavators in this area didn't just find a single dramatic burial, they found many burials, layered and repeated, like the mound was used again and again as a kind of ritual ledger. And in total, we're talking about roughly a couple hundred people interred there, around 270 in many summaries. And among those burials are mass graves, groups of people placed together in ways that don't look like ordinary community burial practice, but like an event, or several events, where human lives were gathered into the ground as part of something larger than themselves. I want to set the tone properly before we go any further, because it's easy, especially online, for this part of Cahokia's story to turn into clickbait, ancient city of sacrifice, prehistoric horror, that sort of thing. And that's not what we're doing here. The people in these graves were real, They had families, they had names we no longer know. They had mournings and aches and jokes and fears. And what we can say from the archaeological record is painful enough without turning it into spectacle. So we'll speak plainly, and we'll keep it human, and we'll keep the gore out of it. Now, one of the most discussed graves in Mound 72 is a pit that held the remains of a large group of young women, often reported as 53 females, mostly in the late teens through around 30, arranged carefully, in layers, with matting between the layers, suggesting this wasn't chaotic disposal, it was organized placement. The details matter because they change the meaning. If you picture some random tragedy, like a sudden epidemic, you'd expect a different kind of burial signature, hurried, inconsistent, desperate. This doesn't read that way. This reads like ritualized death. Many accounts and scholarly discussions interpret it as human sacrifice, possibly by strangulation, precisely because of the demographics, the grouping, and the way the bodies were arranged. And nearby, the mound contained other clusters that point to violence, individuals with signs of execution or traumatic death, bodies arranged in deliberate patterns, and the kind of repeated use of the space that implies a system, not an accident. If you're feeling a little unsettled right now, that's an honest reaction because it forces us to hold two truths at once. Cahokia was capable of astonishing coordination, beauty, and cosmic thinking, and also at times capable of killing people in a way that seems connected to power. It's the part of the story that takes away the easy romance, and it should. But let's be careful with our certainty, because archaeology is a conversation between evidence and interpretation, and Mound 72 has been exactly that. Decades of arguments, refinements, new analyses. For a long time, one common assumption was that the people in those mass graves might have been outsiders, captives from war, raided from distant communities, brought in as offerings. That assumption makes a kind of grim sense in a lot of ancient contexts because many stratified societies use captives as ritual currency. But then research started complicating that tidy idea. A University of Illinois team looked at chemical signatures in teeth, strontium isotope analysis, to estimate where people spent their childhoods, and their results suggested that many individuals in the mass graves likely grew up in or near the Cahokia region, rather than being mostly foreign captives shipped in from far away. That doesn't make the story softer. In some ways, it makes it heavier, because if these were local people, if some of them were from here in the sense of having lived in the region for much of their lives, then we have to consider social mechanisms inside Cahokia itself: hierarchy, coercion, internal violence, the possibility that the victims were chosen because they were vulnerable within the system, not because they came from outside it. At the same time, other biological studies, looking at dental traits and isotopes in earlier work, have argued that at least some groups in Mound 72 might not match the same profile as others, and the wider picture of Cahokia more generally is that it was diverse, with significant movement of people in and out over time. So what do we do with that as storytellers? We don't force it into a single clean explanation. We say what we know, that multiple people were buried together in ways that indicate organized violence or sacrifice, and that the identities of those people, local, immigrant, captive, lower status, socially marginal, may have varied depending on the episode. And then we sit with the implication. The city's spiritual and political system had the capacity to decide whose life could be taken for a public purpose. Now, I want you to picture the scene not as a horror movie, but as a civic ritual. That sounds strange to say, but it's important, because the violence at Cahokia wasn't random violence, it appears tied to meaning. If you're standing in a highly stratified society where leaders claim sacred authority, where the calendar is controlled, where the plaza is a stage, where the Great Mound is a throne, then ritual killing can function as a kind of terrible language. It can be a display that says the center is powerful enough to take life and turn it into order. It can be a warning. It can be a negotiation with the supernatural. It can be a way of renewing legitimacy in a time of crisis. And it can be all those things without the community experiencing it as evil in the modern moral vocabulary. That's hard for us to swallow, but it's historically honest. Human societies have done this in many places and many eras, turning death into a public proof of authority. The reason it hits Americans especially hard at Cahokia is because we're still working against that old stereotype that indigenous North America before contact was small-scale, purely egalitarian, purely peaceful. Cahokia doesn't fit the stereotype in either direction. It wasn't a simple idol, and it wasn't some cartoonish tyranny either. It was a big human society, which means it contained tenderness and cruelty, skill and exploitation, faith and fear. Now, there's another angle here that matters a lot, and it's how this kind of ritual violence might connect to the city's rapid growth. When a place expands fast, when people flood in, when old village identities get scrambled, when new leadership rises and asks for labor and tribute, social stress goes up. You're mixing communities. You're creating new winners and losers. You're centralizing food storage and distribution. You're making hierarchy visible in mounds and plazas. And in that environment, rituals can become more intense, more public, more absolute, because ritual is one of the tools a society uses to stitch itself together. Sometimes that stitching is gentle, feasts, games, sunrise ceremonies. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's the kind of act that burns itself into memory precisely because it's irreversible. If you're a leader trying to hold a big, diverse, restless city together, you don't just want people to respect you, you want them to believe the world collapses if they don't. And nothing makes a claim feel absolute like a sacrifice that can't be undone. That's the cold logic behind a lot of these practices globally, and Cahokia seems, at least at certain moments, to have walked into that logic. Now, let's talk about something that often gets overlooked. The victims are overwhelmingly young, and in the best-known mass grave, overwhelmingly female. That pattern matters because it suggests selection. It suggests that the city wasn't just killing anyone, it was choosing bodies that carried specific symbolic weight: youth, fertility, the future. In many agricultural societies, the symbolism of fertility is powerful, and the pressure to control fertility, socially, politically, ritually, is powerful too. I'm not saying we can decode the exact theological meaning from bones alone. We can't, but we can say the pattern looks purposeful. And when you combine that with the cosmological language we've already talked about, the sky alignments, the layered universe, the sense of a city built as a ritual machine, then it becomes plausible that these deaths were framed as necessary offerings to keep the world balanced, to keep the seasons turning, to keep the city favored. That's a terrifying idea, but it's also a very human one, in the bleakest sense. When people feel the world is fragile, they reach for control. Sometimes they reach for control with calendars and ceremonies and engineering. Sometimes they reach for it with blood. Now, there's a temptation here to imagine a single villain, a tyrant priest-king demanding lives from the top of the mound while the people below tremble. It makes for clean storytelling. It's also usually wrong. Most complex societies don't run on one person's cruelty. They run on systems. Networks of elites, institutions, traditions, social expectations, and the quiet participation of ordinary people who may not love what's happening, but feel they can't stop it, or feel it's necessary, or feel it's not their place to question. That's the uncomfortable truth of power. It rarely needs one monster. It needs many people going along. And again, I'm not accusing individuals across 1,000 years. I'm saying if this practice happened, it happened because it fit into a social world that made it possible. And that world included not only coercion, but belief. Belief deep enough that a community could stand near a mound and accept, or at least endure, acts that would horrify us. One more piece of humility, because it matters. Mound 72 has been reinterpreted in significant ways over time. The famous beaded burial itself, once repeated as a simple story of one elite man, is now understood as more complex, including both male and female remains, according to later analyses. That should teach us something about the mass graves, too. Our interpretations will keep evolving as methods improve and as scholars look again with fresh questions. But even with that humility, the core fact remains. There is real evidence of organized lethal violence in Cahokia's central ritual landscape. And the reason we have to face it is not to sensationalize Cahokia, but to understand it on its own terms. Because a city that can mobilize thousands to build a pyramid of earth can also mobilize people to do things they would never do alone. That's what large-scale human coordination is. It can create wonders, and it can create tragedies, sometimes using the same organizational muscles. So when you hear Cahokia, I want you to hold both images in your mind at once. The sunrise lining up over Monk's Mound, and the quiet pit where bodies were arranged with care. Both are true. Both are part of the same city. And if you're wondering where this leads, if you're thinking avoiding the easy villain story, what changes inside a society when it reaches the point where it starts building walls, then you're exactly where we need to be next. Because after the splendor and the ceremonies and the deepening shadows, we start seeing a new kind of architecture appear at Cahokia. Defensive architecture, barriers, the sense that the center is no longer just sacred, but guarded. At some point, every big city has to answer an uncomfortable question. Are we building a center people run toward, or a center people have to be kept inside of, or kept out of? And at Cahokia, somewhere in the late 1100s, you start seeing that question take physical form in wood and earth, because this is when the palisade becomes part of the landscape, a massive wooden wall encircling the central precinct, punctuated with bastions and controlled entrances, the kind of thing you do when you feel exposed or threatened, or when you want everyone to understand in the most literal way where the line is. Now, I want you to picture what that means if you're living there. A city like Cahokia already has an invisible border, social rules, sacred spaces, the hierarchy that's written into mounds and plazas. Most people don't need a wall to know where they shouldn't go. But when a wall appears, it changes the psychology immediately. You don't have to be a military strategist to understand it. A wall is a sentence. It says, we are separating the heart of the city from everything outside it. It says, access is going to be managed. It says, somebody is worried. And the first thing to say, just plainly, is that you don't build something like that for decoration. Wood is too valuable, labor is too expensive, time is too precious. A palisade of this scale means thousands of trees cut, trimmed, hauled, sunk into the ground, aligned, repaired, watched. And in a floodplain world where rot and storms are always working against you, it means the work never really ends. It becomes part of the city's metabolism, like feeding people, like maintaining the plaza, like keeping the summit building standing. And that right there is what makes it such a telling choice. The city decides to spend energy not only on sacred display, but on containment and defense, sends up a flare in the historical record. So, why? Who were they afraid of? This is where people want a single, clean answer, and we don't really get one, at least not with certainty. But we can talk about the possibilities in a way that feels honest. And honestly, the most interesting part is that the wall makes sense in more than one way at the same time. First, it could be about outside enemies. Cahokia is not sitting in a peaceful bubble. A big, rich center is a target. Wealth attracts conflict. A metropolis with stored food, prestige goods, and concentrated power will always create rivals. It's not hard to imagine raids, small-scale warfare, competition with neighboring polities, grudges, revenge cycles, the whole messy human package. If that kind of tension intensifies, a palisade is practical. It gives defenders a barrier. It creates choke points. It makes surprise attacks harder. It gives people in the core a sense of security, even if it's partly psychological. But second, and this one is harder to say out loud because it makes the story darker in a subtle way, a wall can also be aimed inward. It can be built not just to keep enemies out, but to keep order in. It can help manage crowds during ceremonies, control movement, protect elites from unrest, and signal that the sacred core is not a commons, it's a controlled precinct. Think about what we've already seen in the story. A city that grew rapidly, a city that organized massive labor projects, a city that staged power through mounds and plazas, a city where the archaeological record includes evidence interpreted as ritual killing and execution in the central ritual zone. You don't have to leap to police state fantasies to recognize the pattern. The more hierarchical and stressed a society becomes, the more it invests in mechanisms that make hierarchy harder to challenge. A palisade can be one of those mechanisms. It's architecture doing politics. And third, a wall can be a symptom of fear that isn't even fully about humans. It can be about instability, climate shifts, flooding, resource strain. When a community feels the world is getting less predictable, people get more defensive, physically and socially. They tighten control. They draw boundaries. They cling harder to the center. Even if the threat isn't an army, the response can look like fortification, because fortification is also a way of telling yourself you still have agency. Now let's walk through what it would have felt like, because this is a lecture, not a report. You wake up, you head toward the plaza, and where you used to move through open space, you now see a line of timbers, upright posts forming a barrier that slices the city into inside and outside. Maybe you can still pass through at certain gates, but now you're passing through a place where someone is watching. Maybe not constantly, maybe not like a modern checkpoint, but you can feel the difference. There are entry points. There are places where traffic is meant to flow. And if you've ever lived in a city where certain neighborhoods feel restricted just because of how streets and fences and guards are arranged, you know how fast your body learns the rules without anyone needing to explain them. Children learn them even faster. Don't go there. Don't cross that. Stay with the group. And that changes the social atmosphere. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone is terrified all day. It means the city has started to incorporate caution into its design. And here's the part that's almost always overlooked. Building a wall is also a labor event. It's not just a reaction, it's a campaign. Crews are mobilized, trees are selected and cut, posts are transported, ditches are dug, alignments are measured. If you're a farmer, that means time away from fields. If you're a craftsperson, that means your work is redirected toward producing tools, cordage, repairs, supplies. If you're in the leadership circle, that means you're extracting labor and timber at a scale that has to be justified, because people don't just cheerfully spend their lives building barriers unless they feel the need, or they're compelled, or both. So the wall itself becomes a message not only to enemies, but to the population. The leadership is saying, we are responding to danger, we are protecting the center, and also, we have the power to make you build this. It's a demonstration. Now let's talk about the timing in human terms. By the late 1100s, Cahokia has been running as a giant machine for a long time. Decades of monument building, decades of organizing feasts and ceremonies, decades of managing a dense population with all the health and sanitation and storage problems that come with it. By this point, the city's social order would be well established. So if unrest is part of the story, it's not the simple kind where everyone suddenly wakes up one morning and rebels. It's the slow kind. Tension between neighborhoods, resentment at tribute demands, conflicts between factions, maybe leadership disputes, maybe people moving away, maybe some years of poor harvest that make old agreements crack. In that environment, the wall doesn't mean civil war. It can mean something subtler. The leadership doesn't fully trust the stability of the system anymore. They want the core protected. They want the sacred precinct to be defensible, because if the core falls, politically, symbolically, the whole city's legitimacy could collapse with it. And there's a detail here that I always find telling. Palisades like this often get repaired, sometimes rebuilt, sometimes expanded. Wood rots, storms hit, posts lean, gaps form, and you either let it decay, which sends its own message, or you keep renewing it, which says the concern is ongoing. Maintenance is commitment, and commitment means the fear or the need for control didn't pass quickly, it stayed. Now, I'm not going to pretend we can read minds across 9 centuries, but we can read choices. And the choice to invest in a defensive perimeter is one of the clearest tone changes in Cahokia's physical story. It's like the city stops assuming it can hold itself together through ceremony alone. Ceremony is still there, absolutely, but now ceremony has a fence around it. The sacred is guarded, the elite zone is separated, and that changes how you experience public life. The Grand Plaza is still huge, still capable of gathering crowds, still a stage, but now that stage is inside a controlled precinct, which means crowds can be managed, but crowds can also be trapped. A gate can be opened for a festival, a gate can be closed, and if you're standing in the plaza, you might feel protected, or you might feel in the back of your mind that the city has become a place where movement is no longer entirely yours. And that gets us to the hardest, most interesting question of all. Was the danger outside or inside or both? In real history, it's often both. Outside pressure can heighten inside stress. Rivalries beyond the city can exacerbate factional fights within the city. Resource strain can make leadership more authoritarian. Authoritarian leadership can provoke resistance. Resistance can invite crackdowns. And suddenly the wall isn't a single response, it's part of a feedback loop. Now, I want to connect this back to something earlier because it matters. We talked about Woodhenge as a sacred machine for time, for aligning human life with the sky. We talked about the plaza as a social machine, a place that turns crowds into an audience. We talked about Mound 72 as a ritual ledger that includes both splendor and death. When you add a palisade to that landscape, the city starts to look like a system that's becoming more tense, more guarded, maybe more brittle. It's still powerful. It's still capable of organizing huge projects, but power isn't the same as stability. In fact, Big displays of power can be a sign that stability is slipping, because leaders perform hardest when they feel the need to prove something. And walls are, in their own way, performances too. They are visible statements. We are strong. We are separate. We are protected. We are in control. But if you've studied enough human societies, you know what sometimes comes after walls. Sometimes walls work. They buy time. They discourage attacks. They reinforce boundaries. And sometimes they mark the beginning of an inward turn, where a society starts spending more energy on protection than on flourishing, where maintenance becomes harder, where the cost of keeping the system running rises year after year, where timber becomes scarce, where labor becomes harder to mobilize because people are exhausted or skeptical or leaving. And if you're listening closely, you can almost hear that possibility in the creak of those posts going into the ground. Because to build a wall around your center is to admit, at least privately, that the center can be threatened, that it can fall. And once that thought is inside your political imagination, it tends to grow. So as the palisade rises at Cahokia, post by post, gate by gate, bastion by bastion, the city is still shining, but it's a different kind of shine now. It's not just confidence, it's vigilance, and vigilance is exhausting. Which brings us to the final stretch of the story, the period when the machine begins to falter, when people start leaving, when the grand urban project loses its grip, and the question becomes not how did they build it, but why didn't it hold? If Cahokia's rise feels like someone hitting fast forward, its decline feels more like a long, uneven fade, less apocalypse, more like a city slowly losing the argument it's been making to its own people. Stay, believe, work, invest, keep the center alive. And the first thing to say before we chase any dramatic theory is that the timeline isn't one clean cliff. Cahokia's big urban moment runs roughly from about 1050 to about 1350, with many researchers pointing to around 1200 as a turning point when population and influence begin to slip, and by the mid-1300s the city is largely abandoned. That arc matters because it tells you something simple and very human. Whatever happened, it wasn't just one bad day. It was pressures stacking up, year after year, generation after generation, until leaving started to make more sense than staying. So why did people go? Archaeology gives us a menu of plausible causes, not a single signed confession. And honestly, that's probably the most realistic outcome you could hope for, because big societies almost never collapse for just one reason. They fray, they overheat, they get brittle, they break in multiple places at once. One family leaves because the harvest has been unreliable, another because their kin group is feuding with a faction closer to the center, another because the tribute demands keep rising and the returns, food, security, prestige, keep shrinking. Another because disease has made dense living feel like a bad bargain. Another because the sacred calendar still turns, the ceremonies still happen, but the magic doesn't feel as convincing when the storehouses aren't as full. And if you want to understand voting with their feet, this is the heart of it. People don't need to overthrow the system in one glorious uprising. They can just stop participating. They can move to the edges. They can join smaller communities. They can rebuild somewhere that feels less demanding. Now, one theory that keeps coming up because it makes intuitive sense is environmental damage. Cahokia sat in a landscape that was rich but also delicate, and a metropolis eats its surroundings. You need enormous amounts of wood for houses, fires, palisades, temples, posts, repairs, everything. And one well-known hypothesis is that clearing upland forests east of the city could have increased erosion and flooding, which would hit fields and residential areas and make life harder right when the city needed stability most. National Geographic lays out that argument clearly: deforestation leading to erosion and flooding as a stressor on agriculture and living conditions. Notice what's haunting about that. It's not a comet, it's your own success turning the landscape against you. The bigger you get, the more fuel you need, and the more your systems depend on the land continuing to cooperate. And it's not just forests, it's also the floodplain itself, the American bottom. Fertile, yes, but prone to the kind of water drama that can flip from blessing to problem fast, especially if you're pushing the land hard. Another theory is climate variation and drought. Maybe not one single mega drought right on top of Cahokia, but a pattern of instability that makes maize farming more anxious, more fragile. A St. Louis Public Radio piece, for example, talks through the broader idea of drought periods and notes that by the mid-1300s, Cahokia was largely abandoned. It also points out how tricky it is to pin the entire collapse on a single climatic event because the timing and the regional extent can be messy. And that's the honest stance. Climate can push, but it usually pushes hardest when a society is already strained. Then there's the political and social angle, and this is the one people sometimes resist because it's harder to visualize in a tidy diagram. But think about what Cahokia was: a fast-growing, centralized place with visible hierarchy, mounds literally putting some people above others, and evidence that the sacred center had teeth, real teeth, in how it treated certain bodies. Even if you never witnessed violence firsthand, you would feel the system's weight in daily life: labor demands, tribute expectations, the sense that the center can command. Over time, those systems can produce burnout and resentment, especially if the benefits of urban life, security, feasts, trade access, start to wobble. And when resentment grows, cities don't always explode. Sometimes they hollow out. People drift away to places where local leaders have less reach, where obligations are smaller, where you can breathe. In that reading, the walls we talked about earlier become especially telling, not as proof of one specific enemy, but as a signal that the central precinct felt the need to fortify itself repeatedly. The National Historic Landmark brochure for Cahokia notes that the stockade was built 4 times, with new walls replacing older, decaying ones, and had bastions projecting out at intervals. Maintenance like that isn't casual. It's a city spending precious timber and labor to keep a boundary intact, which can mean outside threats, sure, but it can also mean deep anxiety about control, about keeping the heart of the system protected while the outer parts become less predictable. There's also a quieter theory that doesn't get as much screen time because it's not cinematic: disease and health stress in dense living. A large population living close together, relying heavily on maize, dealing with waste, seasonal hunger, and constant movement of people in and out, those are conditions where illness can spread and where nutrition can become uneven, especially if social inequality shapes who gets what food when supplies tighten. You don't need a plague to create a slow demographic slide. You just need years where childhood survival dips, where infections become normal, where winters feel harder, where the city stops feeling like a good bet. And then, because history loves piling on, all of these factors can amplify one another. Environmental strain can make harvests less reliable. Less reliable harvests can make elites demand more tribute to cover shortages. Higher demands can fuel unrest or quiet disengagement. Unrest can lead to more fortification, which burns more timber, which deepens environmental strain, which worsens harvest reliability. You see the loop. You can almost hear it creaking. And here's another piece that I think matters emotionally. Cahokia's ideology, the whole "we are aligned with the cosmos" posture, may have become harder to sustain as conditions worsened. Because a city like this doesn't just promise food and safety, it promises meaning. It promises that ceremonies matter, that the center keeps the world in balance. But if floods wreck your fields, if drought shrivels crops, if conflict rises, if people start leaving, the promise gets questioned, maybe quietly at first. And once a sacred political system starts being questioned, leaders tend to respond in one of two ways: reform or intensification. Sometimes you get more spectacle, more demands, more rigid control, more "we must do this to restore balance," right up until the point where people decide the balance is gone anyway and their best option is to walk. I keep coming back to that image because it's so plausible. Not a final battle, not one dramatic fire, but a long sequence of departures. A city doesn't have to be destroyed to die. It can simply be abandoned in stages, as neighborhoods thin out, as the core becomes more isolated, as the great plaza feels too empty on days it used to roar. And by the time you reach the mid-1300s, that seems to be where we are. Cahokia still standing as earth and memory, but not functioning as the metropolis it once was. So if you're asking me, as your storyteller by the fire, what's the single cause, I'm going to disappoint you a little, because the single cause is probably not real. The better answer is, Cahokia was a high-performance system, and high-performance systems can be fragile. They need continuous buy-in, food, labor, faith, stability. When enough of those inputs start to falter at the same time, people do the most human thing imaginable. They choose their children over the monument. They choose a smaller life over a grand one that's starting to feel dangerous. They vote with their feet. And then, once the people are gone, the mounds remain, quiet, stubborn, still holding the shape of a world that once believed it could last forever. By the time Americans in the 1800s really started paying attention to the mounds, big ones, small ones, thousands of them across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, there was already a problem waiting for them. And it wasn't an archaeological problem, it was a psychological one. A lot of white Americans simply could not accept that native peoples, the same people they were pushing off the land, had built anything this large, this organized, this intentional. And so the country invented a workaround, a story that let the mounds be impressive without having to give indigenous nations the credit. They called it, in the most blunt, lazy way possible, the Moundbuilders, like it was a separate, vanished race, and then they started filling in the blank with whatever made them feel comfortable. Vikings, lost tribes of Israel, Greeks, Romans, Atlanteans, Welsh princes, you name it. Anything except the obvious answer sitting right in front of them. These earthworks were part of indigenous North America's own deep history. And you have to understand what a useful myth that was, because if the mounds were built by a mysterious lost civilization, and if that civilization was gone, then the people living on the land now could be framed as squatters, latecomers, intruders, like they'd wandered into someone else's ruined estate. That story didn't just satisfy curiosity, it supported a moral alibi. It helped Americans tell themselves, we're not taking land from the builders of these monuments. Those builders disappeared. We're just inheriting a landscape of ruins. That's the emotional job the myth performed, and it lines up way too neatly with the era of removal, expansion, and the loud national insistence that the continent was destined to be remade. Here's the part that always gets me. The people who created these theories weren't all obvious con artists in top hats. Some were educated, some were sincere in their own way, some were early antiquarians trying to do science with the tools they had. But sincerity doesn't make an idea harmless. A lot of them started from a basic assumption, often unspoken, sometimes said out loud, that native societies were too primitive to have produced complex monuments. And once you start there, you'll twist any evidence you find to fit the conclusion. You'll stare at a gigantic mound, and you won't ask, how did indigenous engineers do this? You'll ask, which outsiders could have done this? It's like the question is rigged from the beginning. And the timing matters. In the early and mid-1800s, Americans are building a national identity. They want an ancient past, but they don't want to share it with the people they're displacing. They want romance without responsibility. So the mounds become a kind of haunted inheritance, proof that civilization once existed here, but conveniently not proof that the nations being pushed west had deep ties to the same land. You can see how the myth fits into the mood of the century. It lets settlers feel like they're stepping into history, not erasing it. Now, what makes this even more tangled is that the mounds themselves really are diverse and old and spread across huge distances. Cahokia is the most famous skyline, but it's not the only landscape of earthworks. There are woodland period mounds, Mississippian platform mounds, geometric enclosures, conical burial mounds, ridgetop earthworks. Different eras, different purposes, different communities, and to a 19th century observer who doesn't know the time depth, it can look like evidence of one lost empire that must have had roads and armies and stone cities, because that's what Europeans were trained to imagine when they heard the word civilization. But once you drop the old bias, the real picture is more interesting. Multiple indigenous societies across centuries building monumental landscapes in their own ways, for their own reasons, with real variation, real innovation, and real political complexity. Some of the earliest major archaeological surveys in the United States actually helped preserve the record even while they carried these assumptions. In 1848, Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis published Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, a massive documentation project that mapped and sketched a lot of what they saw. The work is valuable because it recorded sites that later got plowed under or built over. But the interpretation floating around that era still often leaned toward the idea of a separate race of builders, because the country wasn't ready to face the simpler, more honest conclusion. So you get this strange mix: careful drawings, careful measurement, and then a story layered on top that's basically somebody else did it. And then, slowly, that story starts to collapse under its own weight, because archaeology has a habit of doing that. It doesn't care what you want the past to be. It cares what the ground keeps showing you. By the late 1800s, the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology put serious effort into investigating the question, and in 1894, Cyrus Thomas published a major report that is often described as putting the final nail in the coffin of the lost race idea, arguing, with evidence from excavation and comparison, that the mounds were built by the ancestors of contemporary Native Americans, not by mysterious foreigners. That didn't instantly erase the myth from popular culture. Myths rarely die on schedule. But it did shift the scholarly center of gravity. The Moundbuilders weren't a vanished European-style civilization. They were indigenous peoples, period, and the monuments belonged inside native history, not outside it. What's painful and important is that the myth didn't just live in books. It shaped policy attitudes. It shaped how Americans treated sites. It made it easier to destroy mounds because, hey, they're mysterious, not sacred to living communities. It made it easier to treat native claims to place as shallow or recent. And even when the scholarly consensus changed, the vibe of the myth stuck around like smoke in old curtains. You still see it today in fringe documentaries and internet threads that can't resist the Atlantis in Illinois energy. It's always the same move. Take indigenous achievement, call it impossible, then import outsiders to claim it. And if we're doing this story right, if we're being fair to Cahokia, then this chapter isn't a side quest, it's part of the main plot, because it explains why so many Americans can live near these mounds and not know what they are. It explains why America's first metropolis can sit across the river from a major city and still feel like a secret. It explains why people flattened mounds for railroads and subdivisions and barely wrote it down. Forgetting isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's a habit. Sometimes it's convenient. So when we say Cahokia was forgotten, we don't mean it disappeared into the jungle. We mean it was buried under a story the country told itself, one that made the land easier to take and the past easier to own. And once you see that, you start to realize the real work of remembering isn't only archaeological, it's moral, it's cultural. It's choosing to say out loud without flinching, this was a native city, built by native hands, and the fact that America spent so long denying that tells you as much about America as it does about Cahokia. When people call Cahokia lost, I always want to gently push back on the word, because it's only lost in the way something gets lost when a culture decides not to look at it, when a landscape gets paved over and the story gets simplified until it fits on a postcard. The mounds never went anywhere. They've been sitting in the open this whole time, watching the highways arrive, watching St. Louis rise, watching us invent 1,000 reasons to not deal with what they mean. And if you stand there long enough, you start to feel the odd truth of it. The city is quiet, but it's not silent. It's still sending a signal. It's still asking the same question it asked 900 years ago. What kind of society are you building, and what are you willing to forget to keep building it? Cahokia matters first because it expands the American timeline in a way that's hard to unsee once you've seen it. This was urban life in the Midwest centuries before English settlements on the Atlantic seaboard, a planned ceremonial core with monumental public works and a population in the tens of thousands at its height, connected to long-distance networks and held together by food systems, ritual systems, and power systems that were every bit as human, messy, ambitious, creative, sometimes cruel as anywhere else in the world. It matters too because it knocks out that old mental image of pre-Columbian North America as an empty wilderness dotted only by tiny camps. Cahokia is the antidote to that story. And once you accept it, you start noticing how many other places across the continent were shaped, managed, engineered, and governed in ways most Americans were never taught to recognize. And then there's the harder layer, the fact that Cahokia's history was buried for so long under the Moundbuilder myth and other convenient fantasies because acknowledging a native metropolis didn't fit the narratives that made removal and land theft easier to justify. Forgetting wasn't just ignorance, it was useful. And you can still see the residue of that usefulness in how often people treat the mounds like a quirky local attraction instead of a serious World Heritage level site. The city didn't vanish into nothing, and it didn't vanish into myth either. People left the urban core over time, yes, but people didn't stop existing. They carried their stories and kin ties and memories outward into other communities, and the broader Mississippian world continued in different forms. And the descendants and affiliated native nations of this region have their own histories and connections that intersect with this place, even if the exact lines are complex and don't fit a simple one tribe equals one city label. And that complexity is part of the point, because Cahokia wasn't a lone island, it was a hub in a continent-wide web, and the web didn't snap in one moment. It reconfigured, it shifted, it moved, it lived on. So what do we do with Cahokia now, in the 21st century, besides being amazed? I think we do three things, and they're all pretty simple. First, we tell the story correctly. We stop treating indigenous North America as a preface to real American history, and we put Cahokia where it belongs, in the main narrative, not as an exotic sidebar, not as a mystery that needs Vikings to solve it, but as a native achievement with its own logic and its own dignity. Second, we protect what's left, because the most brutal fact about Cahokia is that a lot of it is already gone, flattened by development long before preservation became fashionable. And what survives, survives because someone, at some point, decided it mattered enough to save. Third, and this is the easiest one, you go. If you're anywhere near the Midwest, you visit the site, you walk the ground, you climb Monk's Mound slowly and look out at the river country and let your mind do the time travel. And when you do it with respect, because you're not just visiting a park, you're standing in a place where people built a world, where people suffered, where people celebrated, where the sun was watched like it was a living thing, where power was made visible in earth, and where the past still has the stubborn ability to rearrange the way you see the present. Cahokia doesn't ask you to romanticize it, it asks you to remember it. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep history like this, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.